welcome to the Disrupting Adoption Narratives, Adoptees for Reproductive Justice panel, hosted by Prism Reports. I'm Kimberly Rooney, and I'm the copy editor and fact checker at Prism. So this collective began as a series published by Prism in November and December of 2022 called Adoptees Disrupting Adoption Narratives. It's a series of as told to pieces written and curated by Prism's amazing editor-at-large, Tina Vasquez, featuring our 5 panelists, along with a personal essay by myself. And the series was born from a session organized by Tiffany at Sister Song's Let's Talk About Sex conference in August of last year. If you'd like to read the series, it is available on Prism's website. And if you'd like to follow along, contribute to the conversation, or find panel-related posts later on, you can follow the hashtag #DisruptAdoption on Twitter, which we will be using to live tweet this event. And then as a last little bit of housekeeping, a quick content warning. Since we'll be talking about adoption justice and reproductive justice today, topics of abandonment, religious trauma, and sexual violence may come up. And if that's not something that you can or want to engage with right now, we will be making this panel available later on YouTube, so you can always come back to it. And yeah, totally understand. So yeah, let's dive into this. So let's get started with panelists. Could you introduce yourselves? Maybe start with Tiffany.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Tiffany HyeonBrooks. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a Korean-American adoptee based in Brooklyn, New York, on unceded Canarsie and Munsee Lenape land. And I also identify as a survivor of child sexual abuse and domestic violence. And I'm really grateful to Prism for holding this space for us and really advancing the work of this collective. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Nicole, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Kimberly. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Eigbrett, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm calling in from unceded Pawtucket lands, also known as Somerville, Massachusetts. I'm 30 years old, and I identify as a queer, transnational, and transracial Chinese adoptee. And in this context, transracial refers to an adoptee who was born in a specific racial or ethnic culture, but then was raised in a different one. And for my situation, I was born in China, but I was raised in a white adoptive family system and community. I also identify as a community organizer, a cynical idealist, a lover of food, music, and an advocate for all spaces and things of joy that build relationships across difference. So I'm really delighted and honored to be here on this panel with this amazing group of adoptees.
All right. I'm just going in the order that y'all show up on Zoom for me. Mez, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Hi, my name's Mezekerta Tesfay. I'm an Ethiopian American adoptee. I was adopted by a homoracial couple, and that means that I was adopted by 2 Black parents, and I was raised within 2 different cultures. I am on unceded Tonkawa land in Austin, Texas, and I have she, her pronouns, and I'm happy to be here today.
All right, and Rachel?
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Rachael Murphey. I am a biracial Black, biological father, white biological mother. I was born in January 1968, and I was adopted in March of the same year by the Murphys. According to my research, I was one of 764 officially documented transracial adoptees in 1968, which puts me in a pretty small minority there. I'm the mother of 2 amazing young women, and I live and work in Durham, North Carolina, the unceded home of the Eno, Tuscarora, and Occaneechi peoples. I teach a class on race adoption and foster care, and I use she, her pronouns.
All right, and last but not least, Sheri, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. First, let me say thank you to everyone who is joining this panel with us live and those that will view thereafter. We are so humbled that you are spending your afternoon with us. My name is Reverend Sheri Dickerson. I helm in Oklahoma, which literally means land of the natives, and I am on Kiowa and Chippewa land. I am African American as well as Indigenous, proud member of the Blackfoot tribe. My case was a little bit different in that my case set a precedent in the state of Oklahoma and within this region where I was adopted, the first person to be adopted outside of a blood relation family. And so my adoption process took 4.5 years. Actually 6 total. And I also was within the foster care system. And so I went to 17 different foster homes. Some of the organizations that I'm affiliated with, as well as being part of this amazing group with these amazing people, is I am a board member of Women's March National. I work within Black Lives Matter Network, as well as working with the Interfaith Alliance and the National Board of Clergy Persons, multi-faith and anti-faith. Anything else that I think is important, I'll probably remember to say later. I think I am the elder in this group. I turned 50 in January. My pronouns are they, she, and I am just so happy to be here. Ashe.
Thank you so much. Also, y'all have made me remember that I'm also an adoptee. I'm a Chinese American adoptee from Jiangsu province. I'm based in unceded Osage territory, also known as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And yeah, I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. Yeah, so I guess getting into the questions, I wanted to start actually with an excerpt from the series introduction written by Tina Vasquez. So quote, "No more salvation narratives, no more narratives of gratitude, no more framing adoption as a win-win, no more white saviors. We will question adoption as a system, its power dynamics, its economics, and its privileging of certain reproductive destinies," end quote. So based on all of your introductions, it's clear that we're coming at this from a variety of backgrounds, professional, academic, organizing. So I guess as an opening question, what brought you to this movement, and what do disrupting adoption and reproductive justice mean to you?
I'd be happy to start. So without yet really having the language to describe this experience at the time, I think that my first touch with reproductive justice was when I was living in South Korea, and I was starting to search for my birth family, which is something that is talked about so much. I feel like it gets centered a lot, but it's not actually the center of my story, but I share it in this case because I learned that I was conceived through a rape and that my mother had carried a traumatic pregnancy that she couldn't acknowledge. She could not acknowledge that she was pregnant until 8 months into her pregnancy. And so this is also in South Korea, where abortion was legally criminalized until 2021. And of course, where there is such a stigma against single motherhood. And so this really kind of awakened this question in me around reproductive freedom and kind of the idea of choice in adoption. And so really looking at reproductive justice, which we know is based in a human rights framework around bodily autonomy, the idea of having children, not having children, being able to parent those children in sustainable communities, and also really the fact that adoption, it makes families, but I think more notably, it unmakes families. Adoption really decides who gets to parent and who does not get to parent. Adoption touches so many issues in reproductive justice, from fertility, infertility, unplanned pregnancy. What does family formation look like? And really, I think importantly, the rights of pregnant people and children. And I want to speak to disrupting adoption because to me, that really speaks to adoption abolition and the idea that, as with other abolition theory, that we cannot reform an institution, especially I think in transracial and transnational adoption, which is so deeply rooted in histories of oppression. And you said this in your intro, Kim, but I think it's also the work of Kimberly McKee. I just like to quote her because I think she says this just so perfectly, that it really privileges the reproductive destinies of white people, primarily white parents, over people, pregnant people, and people who can conceive of color. And the idea that relinquishment of a child is really not a true choice in systems of adoption. So I'll leave it there for now.
I'd like to say that for me, disrupting adoption really means listening to, privileging, and prioritizing the voices of adult adoptees. I think that when you look at the adoption triad, and it's usually, you know, the adopted child is at the top, and you've got the birth parents and the adoptive parents, but it doesn't seem like any of the systems and the policies and the procedures are really targeted for the best interest of the child. And I really think that disrupting adoption to me is prioritizing those voices, our voices. And it means challenging and complicating conventional understandings of adoption is always the win-win scenario that we mentioned earlier. It means unpacking and interrogating what racial identity really means and why it's important and to whom and why. And just, you know, my connection to this issue and the connection between adoption and reproductive justice, for me, I mentioned this in my piece. I've always been interested and intrigued by adoption as an adoptee, but the connection to reproductive rights, when I met my birth mother, the very first question she asked me was, you know, in 1968, if abortions were safe and legal, you would have been aborted. And I just remember feeling like, wow. I mean, it was just such emotional manipulation. Like, I think all of us in our stories in Prism mentioned somebody sometime saying this to us. And it's just so illogical and irrational. And like, if we lived in a parallel universe, you wouldn't be born means what? So yeah, I think I'm gonna stop now on that one.
I'll say what brought me to the movement was really looking for community. For most of my life, and I've always known that I was adopted. I attended for 2.5 years the various adoption hearings that we had, and I had 6 people in my biological family, including sibling, grandmother, and both parents that petitioned, and so it just continued. And so I knew that I had been, literally, my relationships with my biological family were severed. And nobody asked me how I felt, what I wanted, or what I needed. And then no one addressed the trauma that was actually thrust upon me, as well as all parties involved. It can be a very violent and brutal process. And we tend to glorify and try to put adoption in this box where it is win-win or beautiful, or it turned out the way the universe said that it was supposed to. Now, do I believe in divine intervention? Yes. Am I a person of faith? Yes. And has my faith helped give me an anchor in walking through this experience of being an adoptee? Absolutely. But really what tethers me to all of my fellow panelists and those that share their story and those that don't, because it's very important to acknowledge that there are some that cannot, some that do not know, and some that make the choice. And we honor and uplift your right to not speak on your adoption or about your experience, that you are still part of this really cool, phenomenal, wacky, emotional, all of the attributes and adjectives as an adoptee. And so I was just trying to fit in. And I think I'm still trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up.
Yeah, similarly to Sheri, same deal for my life. You know, I think I've always searched for belonging, authenticity, and safety, you know, not only within the community that I existed within, but also within myself. And so for my journey into not only the repro justice movement, but social justice in general, really came from that simple desire to create and be part of a community that truly embraces all of me, and unfortunately was evasive for the first half of my life. And so I talk about this in my piece as well, that it was in college that I was finally starting to be exposed to things like feminism and Marxist critical race and political economic theory. But honestly, it wasn't until I you know, kind of left many of these predominantly white spaces and then was really becoming an adult on my own in my 20s, where I was able to put these theories into practice and praxis as an organizer working in not only working class communities, but also the Asian American Pacific Islander and Chinese adoptee communities, you know, working and organizing for racial, economic, and queer justice. And, you know, it was in this past decade that I really began to come out of the fog, which is a term that many adoptees use when you start kind of connecting the dots and, you know, shedding these narratives that not only your adoptive family, but society is, you know, forcing us to swallow, and began really telling my story. So at this point in my life, I do, similarly to Tiffany, identify as an adoption abolitionist, meaning that I advocate for ending all forms of adoption. But it's not simply about destroying a system, it's about transforming and creating new ones. And so to me, that means transforming systems of state violence and harm into ones of abundance and resource, so that we can end the practices of family policing, surveillance, and separation in favor of preservation, and ultimately what children and now adult adoptees ourselves fundamentally need.
I got into the reproductive justice movement doing abortion rights work and working with abortion funds. And I really like what Nicole said about coming out of the fog, because that's kind of what happened for me. Was as I was helping my organization in particular, we help youth who need abortions. And as I was working with young teens who were not interested in being pregnant or having a child, I started to think about how the country I'm from, Ethiopia, we have a lot of young mothers because there's like a lack of birth control. And I wondered, I don't know who my parents are. I don't have my birth parents are. I don't have any birth records. I have no way of ever contacting them. Don't know where I was born. Kind of like a blank slate. I wondered if I was the product of a teen mom who maybe didn't want to have a child, and what kind of decision she would have made had she had the choice to choose. And that's when I started to connect my story as an adoptee to reproductive justice, because prior to that, I didn't think I really had a personal connection to the reproductive justice movement, besides the fact that I had a uterus and could potentially bear a child. And it was insane when I started to connect those dots, and realized that I had a story to tell, and I had some important work to do in recentering the narrative of adoption onto adoptees and not the people doing adopting, which is also my answer for what I think disrupting adoption is.
Yeah, thank you so much, all of you, for sharing that. What y'all were saying, like Rachel, especially about like focusing on adoptees and disrupting adoption, that really resonates with me so much, because when I was doing my thesis research in college on racial identity formation in Chinese American adoptees, so much of the impetus for that was that I was, you know, looking in, you know, academic spaces for work on Chinese adoptees, and overwhelmingly it was about adoptive parents of Chinese adoptees, or if it was about us, it was about us as children, and very often it was our adoptive parents who were filling out information about us for these studies. And so I really wanted to contribute to a body of work about, but also by adoptees. And so like disrupting adoption for me is so rooted in that sense of community and that sense of, listening to and uplifting each other. And yeah, as I guess an extension of interrogating adoption as adults, Mez, in your piece, you talked about adoption not just as a personal experience that as we get older we start to interrogate more, the phrase that Nicole used, like coming out of the fog, but also realizing that adoption is a system, and very often a violent and traumatic system. So I wanted to ask, what are the systems of violence that lead to and require adoption? Nicole, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think it's really important that we step back and take kind of this biggest picture systems lens on adoption, because the modern day practice of adoption is fundamentally an industry. It's an unregulated global industry that makes profit, and to its most violent extent is its own form of human trafficking. And I want to speak specifically about transnational adoptions, but the industry itself is based in legacies of colonialism, imperialism, and white supremacy. So for myself as a Chinese adoptee, my existence is inherently tied to the one-child policy that was passed in China in 1980 and existed until 2016. And in 1992, China opened its borders to transnational adoptions. And, I kind of had this realization only a couple months ago that given my age and the year that I was born and the year I was adopted, I am kind of at the upper end and the oldest of this generation of mostly adoptees who were assigned female at birth, who were forced by the state to be given and taken away. And we'll hear about kind of other contexts, but at least again in the Chinese one, it's undeniable that these policies that are rooted in sexism, misogyny, and violence in the name of national mythologies such as economic progress and other things, that led to the generation of trauma that so many of other adoptees like me are carrying. I highly recommend watching the documentary One Child Nation if you're interested in learning more about Chinese adoptees. And, it's when I first confronted this as a student doing research and learning about the way the government's secrecy, lies, and coercion led to forced abortions and sterilization. It was incredibly traumatic to put that in front of me and understand, again, this was the harm that the state caused upon, millions of families and now children. And I think the other piece here, especially in transnational adoptions, is the role that Christianity has played, and especially white Christian missionaries who facilitated this trafficking and profit making, and the Christian agencies on the United States kind of receiving end, who are still playing and perpetuating this white industrial savior complex. But just to ground it back down, as me as an individual and an adoptee today, I'm left without the truth of my origins, right? Like, there's a strong chance that the state orphanage where I was supposedly abandoned, right? My story itself I can't even trust that that's true. And I think a lot of the trauma that I'm trying to process is the fact that I need to make peace with that. I may never even truly know what my origins are, no matter what the state or my white adopters tell me. And again, I want to emphasize this is just one very specific transnational context, and there are domestic adoptees in our panel today who can speak also to the disproportionate harm here in the United States that Black and Indigenous families have suffered under this similar system.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. Yeah, the ways that white supremacy just weaves and threads throughout adoption, both international and domestic, is something that I really do hope is one of the main takeaways from this panel today. But yeah, would anyone else like to share their thoughts about systems of violence within adoption?
Yeah, oh, sorry, Sheri, do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead.
I just wanted to add to what Nicole was saying about how I think also fundamentally, naming that adoption is a racial justice issue. And I really want to speak to also how the majority of adoptive parents are white, and the majority of children who are adopted come from communities of color. And that's primarily Black and Indigenous communities, as well as people from the global majority. And so I think that raises, the issue of that most adoptions are transracial in nature. And what does that say about who can parent and who we are saying are good parents? And I think we're also seeing that play out. We're seeing policies, anti-trans policies in place as well that are looking to remove children from their gender affirming and loving households and place them essentially into Christian foster care homes. We've also seen this with migrant children at the border whose parents just disappeared, that their roots were just really taken from them, and they were also placed into foster care, again, into good Christian homes. And so I think this really speaks to, again, the idea of whose reproductive destinies are we privileging at the expense of the reproductive freedoms of other people.
One, I want to just kind of echo and plus one what Tiffany just said. And I also want to acknowledge that white supremacy just literally interweaves the violence of that system in almost every aspect of life and everyone's existence. And white supremacy also harms our white adoptees and those and poor white people and people with wombs who are queer, who are white. So I don't want to make it seem like we're bashing. It's the system, and it's working like it was designed to literally be destructive, to be controlling. And as a person who is Black and who is Indigenous, who was raised by Black parents who were organizers, who were Christians, but had adopted the faith and the theology of white Judeo-Christian teachers and theologians, which removed all of the tribal and literally grounding practices that was Christianity long before Black people were enslaved and the lands were stolen from Indigenous people. Actual adoption is innate and natural because we are communal. Our culture is communal. You have a village, and so many people in that village are responsible and feel obligated to make sure that they are nurturing the children in that particular community. So I have a plethora of parents and grandparents and siblings and cousins and and dealing with abandonment issues, I cling to those who are accepting and welcome me in as family. And so DNA and genetics don't matter to me as far as who my family is. But adoption standards and policies remove all of the things that could be so amazing about creating family. So this is why I want to disrupt the narrative. Right now am in the process of adopting a child who is my niece, because my brother passed away, was murdered, and the mother was domestic violence. And so I'm an advocate for being able to take in this child who is my relative, who is going to be my daughter. But I don't appreciate the standards and the policies of white supremacy telling me and trying to decide whether or not I'm appropriate, my finances are acceptable, if my home is, if I have enough room, do I have the right type of things needed to be able to raise a child, when I've been raising children in my village for over 30 years. So that's also my reason for wanting to abolish the system as it stands.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, like, white supremacy just threads through everything in our lives. Because I know for me, so much of what made me grapple with this intersection of adoption justice and reproductive justice was being sexually assaulted by a white man when I went back to China for the first time since leaving as a baby. And it was through the process of healing and just trying to think about what had happened that I really started to grapple with, you know, how white supremacy threaded through both of those experiences, how it shaped narratives of victim blaming and power dynamics that led to both, you know, my adoption, but then also, you know, what motivated this white man to be in China to target me. And from there is when I started thinking more broadly about, you know, what does reproductive autonomy mean? What does bodily autonomy mean in these intersecting contexts? And to that point, as we were planning for this panel, Sheri, you said something that really stuck with me, that this isn't actually about an intersection. Adoption justice is reproductive justice. And do you think that you could explain and expand on that for our audience?
Just very quickly, when I was at the Let's Talk About Sex conference and heard that there was a session that centered adoption, I cannot describe the feeling, because it was like, finally, someone got it. And then I walk in a room, which of course I'm biased, but I felt like should have been full with people wanting to acknowledge and understand that this isn't, that adoption justice is not adjacent, that adoption justice isn't secondary, that it isn't something that only people who have been adopted or have adopted someone are part of. It affects everyone. And so that was my reasoning in saying that surely, even those that are the leaders and those that literally coined the phrase reproductive justice and who's continued to stand on the front lines for all of the isms and fighting for marginalized people, that they acknowledge what happens within the system of adoption, because it really mirrors enslavement. It mirrors religious trauma and violence. It mirrors racial trauma. It mirrors the erasure of those who are perceived as different, because not one person on this earth and who has existed is the same. So we're all different. And so I said that I'm not a charity case. I don't want to check other on a box, and I do not want my life experience invalidated, nor do I need to look for validation from other systems within the realm of reproductive justice, because it might sound a little bit arrogant and almost like you're comparing yourself to a deity, but I am that I am, and we are that we are, and we don't have to give excuse or reasoning for the fact that we are here and we're supposed to be here with divine purpose, regardless of our process, how we were birthed, why we were birthed, and the fact that, thank God, our parents, for whatever reason, made the choice or didn't have the choice that they did that brought us here.
Yeah, thank you so much for that explanation. Yeah, I would like to open it up to the rest of the panelists if you have any thoughts on this, and particularly in light of how a lot of conservatives have been very quick to use adoption as a kind of discursive tool, as like a weapon against the push for abortion access and bodily autonomy. How can we dispel this myth that we have to choose between adoption and abortion, as though, you know, those are the only two options?
Oh, go ahead.
Just
No, let's go
having
ahead.
worked within abortion and being an adoptee myself, I'm going to sound like a broken record today because I'm going to say this point like over and over again. Adoption is not an action that people take when they want a child. It is an experience that happens to a human being or multiple human beings. And it is an experience that happens in a traumatic and a system that can be very painful, even though there are good and bad moments. And so for someone to say that adoption is an alternative to abortion, they are centering the parents who want a child, who want to adopt a child. They're not even centering the parent who is going to have to hold that child, give birth to it, and potentially have health problems, potentially have to be a Black mother giving birth in a country that does not prioritize the health of Black mothers or listen to them when they're in pain. And it's going to end up being a traumatic experience for the mother and then the child who is born. If we stop centering the people who want children, who do not need children, but want them. I think there's this myth, there's this idea that people need children, and that's why they see adoption as this beautiful thing. I needed a child, I couldn't have one, whether you couldn't conceive of one or whatever, and I needed it. You didn't, you wanted one. It was a choice, and it was a choice that only you were given because you have the privilege to have it. So dispelling the idea that people need children, they don't, they want them. And then dispelling the idea that that child has no autonomy or say in what is happening to them, and that the mother or the person who gave birth to them also has no autonomy or decision of whether they want to carry that child to term.
I wanted to make a point. I remember being in a college classroom as a younger person and hearing people say really tone deaf things like, well, aren't Black people far better off now than they would have been if we hadn't brought them over from Africa? And I think we can all recognize that as really tone deaf and ignorant and just not accurate in any way. It's the same analogy that we hear a lot of times from white adoptive parents saying, oh, or believing in their heart that they're saving a child and that they're so much better off than they would have been if they were with those poor parents or if they were with those heathens in another country or whatever. And it's the same tone deaf idea that whiteness and whoever they are is the end all be all in humanity, and that we all need to be lucky enough to be that. And I just think it's the same, and it's the same argument, and it's wrong in the same ways.
Yeah, I really hear that, Rachel. And I also wanted to point to a study that was done by Gretchen Sisson, the sociologist, that really looked at people who wanted an abortion but were turned away, and saw that it was a very low percent who chose to relinquish a child for adoption when placed in that situation, and that the primary driver of people who did place their children for adoption was financial hardship. So that it wasn't, that kind of true choice that is portrayed, often. And to Kim's point, I do see this so much that the right has kind of taken a hold of this adoption narrative. I mean, we saw those like, we will adopt your baby signs, and that I really also feel like the left has not, for some reason, taken up adoption as a reproductive justice issue and as an issue speaking to so many of the social justice issues, allegedly kind of taken on by like more liberal thinking people.
Yeah, and just to drive some of these points home, when we think about, again, who has the privilege in this country, especially to become a parent, we don't see conservatives advocating for universal health care, housing as a human right, food access and security. And when the data shows us that it's often, already oppressed communities who lack all these resources, who are being the ones forced into making these decisions that are not fundamentally their own. And I just want to loop back to Sheri's point about adoption as a practice existing since the start of human civilization, right? And where we are now in society, right? We have a very nuclear concept of what family is, and that is reinforced by our laws and institutions that say 2 parents, 2 children, 1 house. And I think that too creates so much violence in the way children are raised, because if we had communities, the way, in the past or in indigenous societies, right? And other countries and outside of the United States that still practice this, that are multi-generational, and it is expected that your entire neighborhood is looking out for your child, not just the biological parents. I think this would also be a different conversation. But here in the United States, in our very particular context of racial capitalism, a lot of those resources are just not available.
Can I just say one really quick thing too, in terms of what Nicole just said? When you look at the foster to adopt system, and you think about the logic of it, right? We're going to take kids away from a home that's in poverty, right? That shows up as neglect sometimes in our public schools. And we're going to put them in a almost always white home with more resources. And then we're going to pay them. And we're going to make sure that that family has free access to healthcare for those children that we just took from the poor family. How does that make any sense whatsoever at all? Like, why doesn't it make more sense to preserve the family, make sure they have free access to healthcare? If the money that we gave to the white families that we take, the whole thing doesn't make any sense at all. And I think that we need to really rip the sheet off of that and uncover that.
Yes, thank you so much for pointing out the intersections with classism and the ways that poverty is just read as neglect, and particularly how that's racialized in the context of adoption and foster care systems. Yeah, that is something that came up several times throughout the series, and I'm so glad that it was brought up again today in this panel. And as well as Rachel, your point about the, so many adoptees have heard this, that, we're supposed to feel lucky or grateful for having been adopted. I am a transracial adoptee. I was adopted into a white family that was, upper middle class. And so a lot of people point to that for me as a like, well, your life is so much better than it would have been if you hadn't been adopted. And, one, they don't know if that's true. I also don't know if that's true for that matter, but that also just completely ignores, the material systems and the political histories too, that remove children from their families, and deem, other families or prospective parents as more capable, while also giving them the resources to be more capable. And yeah, as we're talking about this idea of, adoptees should feel lucky or grateful, I did also want to touch on the sort of shift, I think, among adoptive parents and also prospective adoptive parents towards an interest in, quote unquote, doing adoption right. And how a lot of adopters and potential adopters often reach out to adoptees and ask us questions about, what can they do? And very often it's a means of soothing consciences about, the harms and the violences of the adoption experience. But it also, puts a lot of pressure on adoptees to, have a response ready. What would you want people to know about the system of adoption and how individuals are moving through this or are complicit in these systems in ways that, trouble the idea of doing adoption right, or maybe even mean that that is just the wrong question to be asking? Rachel, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, I think this is a very nuanced question, and it's there's a lot going on here with this question for sure. I want to take one quick minute to say that I really think Donald Glover's Atlanta series, season 3, episode 1 is fantastic. That really illustrates exactly what we're talking about in terms of the violence, poverty, transfer of wealth type of stuff. So I just want to push that out there. Atlanta season 3, episode 1, very good stuff. In terms of how to do it right, is that even the right question? I'm not an adoption abolitionist. I think adoption is going to happen and will continue to happen in our country. I think we have, I understand and am attracted to the idea of burning it to the ground and starting from scratch and building it up again. That's still adoption, right? So here's my bottom line. I really believe that we have to hold adoptive parents and governmental and non-governmental agencies legally culpable for stealing children when that is happening. And adoptive parents especially, they need to be held responsible. If you're going to adopt a child, you need to, as best as you possibly can, make sure that the child is being relinquished in a ethical way, right? That's number one. And you need to be held legally responsible. Number two, if you are a white family and you want to adopt a Black and brown child, you need to ask yourself a lot of questions and educate yourself. And you've got to ask yourself why. But the most important question from my humble perspective is, if you don't know any Black and brown people, why are you adopting a Black and brown baby? If you don't have any Black and brown people in your neighborhood, why are you adopting a Black and brown baby? Because who are they going to see in the mirror as representative of who they are? We all know social media. We all know the media, what it tells us about Black and brown people. If you don't have any people, Black and brown people in these children's lives, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think they're going to think about themselves? And obviously, I'm like ratcheting up here to DEFCON 10 because it's emotional. It's really important. I think in all of the pieces that we published in this series, all of us touched on racial identity development. And thank goodness we had the privilege to go to college and have those awakenings, and we're able to take the fogged glasses off. But it's basic. It's basic. If you don't have these people in your life, if you can't call these people your friends, if they're not in your wedding pictures, why are you adopting Black and brown kids? I'm going to stop.
Rachel, thank you so much. You have helped me. You always do, but today what you've said has just kind of given my spirit a hug, and I thank you and each of you all. But I mean, what in the hell is happening within these systems? And yes, I'm a whole pastor, and I curse because I don't believe that my faith system, when someone is crucified, they were trying to make sure that their language was politically correct. So charge it to my head and my heart because I said what I said. I don't care if you are a white person and you do have Black and brown friends. We need to remind you that we are not a monolith. And so whatever the one or two, sometimes people get really bold and courageous and they will take in 3 people of color into their circle, and they feel like, oh, then I am qualified and it is okay. And so if we would get to a place where we stopped centering whiteness and decided to embrace rightness, a lot of us would be, the world, humanity would be the better for it. And so I was adopted from a Black family into a Black family. And I don't say that I've never felt lucky, but I've never felt unlucky because I don't know what would have happened in that other experience. And I knew my birth parents, and I knew the first set of parents who wanted to adopt me. And I have relationships with all of my siblings. And so for me, I feel fortunate. I have some adoptees who say, I don't want to have relationship with those, and it doesn't even matter why the adoption happened. And so we just need to, I'm not an abolitionist around adoption. In so many other things I am, and I want to burn it down, crush it, and will take as many arrests as I need to be able to amplify our voices. But sometimes if you would just listen to the silence would tell you in the room that what is transpiring is not okay.
Thank you, Rachel and Sheri, for really setting the stage for this part of our conversation. And this was kind of mentioned earlier, but I want to be really directed about it again, is that adoptees are not blank slates. We are not babies. Okay, so let me back up. I think, Rachel, I love what you said about what's the legal framework around adoption right now. And I said earlier, it's very much an unregulated industry. and the way the industry has navigated adoption and framed it, and you know, the way they've screened families and educated prospective adopters has changed over time. And so I understand that, like, when I was adopted in the early 90s, my white parents were told by their white Christian adoptive agency that you should adopt these children of color and treat them as if their own, and really like emphasize this racially colorblind approach, not recognizing that this would cause, you know, irreparable racial trauma upon myself and my other adopted siblings. And so I think it's really important that, you know, everyone recognize that, you know, the baby, the child, no matter their age, they are not a blank slate. But I think far too many adoptive parents believe that's the case, and that simply their love and their, you know, their lifestyle and resources will just fill that child and be enough. And I think the last thing I want to mention too is that I came across this heartbreaking statistic in a New Yorker article published at the end of last week about the fact that adoptees are disproportionately represented in psychiatric hospitals and suicidality rates and depression and other mental health crises. And I think that right there underscores the undernamed and misunderstood trauma in our community.
Love is not enough. It just isn't. Love is just not enough. I have a cup that I got in an adoption conference once that says, transracial adoptee, my superpower is making everyone uncomfortable. I live that.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I did want to move into the Q&A section. I feel like we've been, I guess, talking around the first question in, you know, talking about how adoption justice is, you know, related to, you know, housing rights and food access and, you know, issues of classism and white supremacy. But one person did want just a like 101 explainer on what is adoption justice.
I'm going to keep this really brief, but I think adoption justice is, when broken down, is giving children autonomy back. And that doesn't mean you like let your 4-year-old make all their decisions for themselves, but it means remembering that that child is going to grow, that you are adopting, whatever age you're adopting that, even if they're 17, is going to grow into an adult that has an unfillable hole in them and wounds within them, and that they might not know how to cure them. They might not know how to fix them. They might never be able to heal themselves and move on. It's understanding that like that child has to live with that. And so you have to give the child the autonomy in your brain to understand that like that kid is going to be a whole person, like it's thinking before you adopt. It's thinking before you have a child, that it's not a baby for you. It's not an addition to your family. It's not a do-over because you couldn't have a child. That is a complex human being. I think children are very mistreated in our society. They're seen as not as complex as adults, and they are bullied and they are abused and they are harmed. And adoption is one of those ways that happens to them. So if you are watching this right now and you never plan to adopt and you're just here to learn, one way that you could enact adoption justice, in my mind, as an adoptee in your own house, is giving your children more autonomy in your mind and to them as a person, treating them as a complex human being, asking them more questions, and just wondering about them and who they're going to be, and not just seeing them as an extension of yourself.
I totally agree with that, Mez. Thank you. I think one thing that to me sounds like adoption justice, and something that my parents, I think, did really well, is they let me be angry when I needed to be angry. As you can see, that still is part of who I am. And they didn't get stuck in being defensive about where my anger was coming from. And I'm grateful for that. And I think that is an aspect of adoption justice.
And can I say that justice is defined differently by everyone? And so what I perceive as adopted justice is probably going to be different from everyone else. So that's a very difficult answer, because there is no wrong answer. It is just, it's individualistic, and it depends on how that person perceives justice as a whole.
Nicole or Tiffany, would you like to share your thoughts?
Sure. I think also, like, I think connecting to what my fellow panelists have said, really looking at adoption kind of along the lifespan, and that adoption really creates, as we've talked about, these lifelong identities. We're assuming, these lifelong identities that we have no choice, but to live, in this way of not knowing our histories, of being infantilized as children, throughout our adulthood. When we're critical, we're seen as angry. And I think, to me, adoption justice is also listening to adoptees, taking us seriously, not thinking that we're just all angry and overly emotional, like that we have a critical analysis that we're bringing to this space. And also looking, I think for me, looking at first mothers and women who also, or people who are pregnant who relinquish their children, and the identities that they are taking on. So those are also lifelong identities that they will have to contend with. And similarly, they are also, like adoptees, very prone to mental health struggles and suicidality. And that is something that is like very real for us. That it isn't just that gratitude narrative, and it's not win-win, that it can be very harmful. And so I think for me, adoption justice is really looking, across the lifespan at what it means to be an adoptee, and kind of how that affects us, forever.
Yeah, in addition to the amazing things my fellow panelists have said, I also see adoptee justice as making sure that adoptees can be more at the center of decision making and institutions of power whose policies and decisions are going to impact us. And there's no excuses anymore, right? We're not babies. We are grown people, exactly what Tiffany said, with complex analyses. And so we should be at the table. And so until we arrive at the future I'm hoping for, where adoption is no longer needed as a system in practice, like there should be adoptees on the board or in positions of power of adoption centers and policymakers as well. And so I hope for that future as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, all of you, for sharing all of that. We are a little past 5 o'clock, so I think we're going to wrap up for today. But thank you, everyone who attended and who is also catching this in the future on YouTube. Thank you so much to all of you panelists for being part of this series and being part of this panel today. It was so lovely talking with you. And thank you to Prism for hosting and giving us this platform. You can follow Prism on Twitter and Instagram at Prism Reports. You can also follow us on LinkedIn if you're so inclined. And we have further coverage of reproductive justice on our website as well. We'll be sending out links to the resources and articles mentioned during this talk, including the Adoptees Disrupting Adoption Narratives series via email. And if you'd like to keep in touch with the Disrupting Adoption Collective, or if you have any questions, feel free to DM us on social media or reach out via email. And you can contact us at hello@prismreports.org. So thank you again so much for spending this time with us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.